The year was 1887, and the woman standing in the middle of Stone Creek didn't look like someone who was about to change everything. She was 18 years old, her boots were split at the seams, her hands were raw from 3 days of moving stone, and the hem of her dress had been soaked through since dawn. Beside the bank, a boy of 10 and a girl of 6 watched her with the quiet, absolute trust of children who had run out of other options. The men of the valley had already made their judgment. Silas Greer, who owned most of the good land between the ridge and the river, had ridden past twice that week. He hadn't stopped. He didn't need to. One look at the girl wrestling stones into a creek told him everything he thought he needed to know. She was going to fail. She was going to freeze. And come spring, someone would have to explain to the county what happened to the 3 Vance children who had no business being out here in the first place. What Silas Greer did not know, what none of them knew, was that Nora Vance wasn't guessing. She was following instructions. Written by hand in faded brown ink in a small leather notebook she had found sewn into the lining of a dead woman's coat. Her mother's coat, her mother's notebook, her mother's plan. The year was 1887, and the woman standing in the middle of Stone Creek didn't look like someone who was about to change everything. She was 18 years old, her boots were split at the seams, her hands were raw from 3 days of moving stone, and the hem of her dress had been soaked through since dawn. Beside the bank, a boy of 10 and a girl of 6 watched her with the quiet, absolute trust of children who had run out of other options. The men of the valley had already made their judgment. Silas Greer, who owned most of the good land between the ridge and the river, had ridden past twice that week. He hadn't stopped. He didn't need to. One look at the girl wrestling stones into a creek told him everything he thought he needed to know. She was going to fail. She was going to freeze. And come spring, someone would have to explain to the county what happened to the 3 Vance children who had no business being out here in the first place. What Silas Greer did not know, what none of them knew, was that Nora Vance wasn't guessing. She was following instructions. Written by hand in faded brown ink in a small leather notebook she had found sewn into the lining of a dead woman's coat. Her mother's coat, her mother's notebook, her mother's plan. The trouble had started, as most trouble does, long before anyone recognized it as trouble at all. Aldous Vance had been a good man once. That was the tragedy of it. Not a great man, not a visionary, not a builder of things meant to last. But good in the way that mattered in a place like Stone Creek Valley, honest with his handshake, faithful to his word, willing to work from first light to last. He had come west from Ohio in 1869 with nothing more than a wagon, a young wife, and the particular brand of stubbornness that passed for courage on the frontier. For nearly 15 years, the stubbornness had been enough. He had broken ground on 40 acres of valley floor, built a timber house with his own hands, raised 3 children, and buried 1. He had survived 2 droughts, 1 flood, and a winter so brutal it took 11 cattle and 4 of his neighbors' horses before February was done. He had done all of this beside a woman named Eliza, who was by every measure that mattered the better half of everything they had built together. Eliza Vance had a quality that her husband admired and never fully understood. She noticed things, not in the way of gossip or idle observation, but in the deep, methodical way of someone who believed the world was trying to tell you something if only you were quiet enough to hear it. She would spend an hour at the creek bank watching the way water moved around a submerged stone. She would walk the south-facing hillsides in late October, pressing her palm flat against the earth, feeling for warmth that had no business being there. She kept a notebook, small leather-covered, filled with observations in her precise, unhurried hand that she treated with the same careful attention most women of her era reserved for their Bibles. When Eliza died in the winter of 1885, she took with her the particular intelligence that had kept the Vance homestead not just surviving but slowly, quietly thriving. What she left behind no one fully understood yet. Aldous did not grieve well. This was not a character failing so much as a structural one, like a wall built without a proper foundation. It stood for a while and then it didn't. He worked harder, which was the only language he had for pain. He worked until his hands shook and his eyes went hollow. And when the work was done and the house was quiet and the children were asleep, there was nothing between him and the silence that Eliza had left. He started sitting with Clement Burr at the trading post on Friday evenings. Clement kept a back room with a card table and a bottle that never seemed to run dry. Aldous was not a gambling man by nature, but he was a lonely one, and loneliness makes a man reach for whatever warmth is closest. By the spring of 1886, he owed Clement Burr $40. By the fall, it was $200. By the following spring, it was a number that made his chest tighten every time he tried to count it. It was Silas Greer who offered a way out. Silas Greer was 55 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a face that looked as though it had been left out in too many Wyoming winters, creased and weathered and honest in its severity. He had known Aldous Vance for 18 years. They had helped each other with harvest, shared equipment, argued companionably about fence lines. When Silas heard about the death, he did not cluck his tongue or offer pity. He did what he understood. He made a practical arrangement. He would pay Clement Burr in full. In exchange, Aldous would sign over the water rights to the eastern quarter of his land, including the stretch of Stone Creek that ran along the property's edge. Not the land itself, Silas was careful to say, just the water rights. Just a piece of paper. Aldous signed. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he would earn it back. He told himself a great many things in the way that men tell themselves things when they are choosing not to look directly at what they are doing. He did not tell Nora. Nora was 16 when her mother died and 17 when she began to understand what the dying had cost them. She was the oldest, the one who had inherited Eliza's habit of watching, though she didn't yet have her mother's patience or her mother's certainty. What she had instead was a sharp, uncomfortable awareness that things were going wrong in ways she couldn't yet name. She watched her father shrink. She watched the Friday evenings become Saturday mornings. She watched the way Aldo stopped looking at the creek, the way Eliza had taught him to look at it as a resource, as a system, as something that could work for you if you understood it, and started looking at it the way a man looks at something that no longer belongs to him. She did not know about the paper he had signed. Not yet. What changed everything was a woman named Dora Finch, who arrived in Stone Creek Valley in the early summer of 1887 with 2 trunks, sharp tongue, and a widow's legal freedom to do as she pleased. She was 43 years old, handsome in a severe way, and she had identified Aldous Vance with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to recognize a man in need of managing. They were married by September. Nora tried. She was not a petty girl, not a small-minded one, and she understood in the abstract that her father was lonely and that loneliness was not a sin. But Dora Vance now had a way of making the house feel smaller from the inside. She rearranged furniture. She threw away things that had belonged to Eliza without asking. She spoke to Cole and May with the brisk impatience of someone performing a duty rather than offering affection, and she spoke to Nora not at all, which was somehow worse. In October, 3 weeks after the wedding, a jar of preserves went missing from the root cellar. Dora told Aldous that Nora had taken them to trade at the post without permission. Nora had not taken them, she said so plainly and without theatrics, looking her father directly in the eye. Aldous looked at his new wife, then he looked at the floor. I think he said in the voice of a man who had already decided that it would be better if you had your own arrangements. Those were the words, not you are wrong, not I don't believe you, not even I'm sorry, just it would be better. Nora stood in the kitchen of the house her father had built and her mother had made into something worth living in, and she understood with perfect, terrible clarity that the decision had already been made before he said a word. Dora had simply handed him the excuse he needed to stop carrying something he had never known how to carry. She went to her room and she packed what was hers. Cole was waiting at the door when she came out, his jaw said in the careful, determined way of a boy trying very hard to look like he wasn't afraid. May was beside him, holding his hand. Nora looked at them. She thought about telling them to stay. She thought about all the sensible reasons why two children should remain in a warm house with a man who was their father, however diminished he had become. She looked at May's face. She looked at Cole's jaw. She picked up her bundle and walked out the door. They followed. The first night they slept under a limestone overhang 2 miles from the homestead, wrapped in the 2 blankets Nora had taken, listening to the creek run dark and fast in the darkness below. May slept almost immediately, the way young children do, with a completeness that looked almost like faith. Cole did not sleep, neither did Nora. "What are we going to do?" Cole asked. He kept his voice flat, practical, like a boy who had decided that panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. "I'm thinking," Nora said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." Cole was quiet for a while. "Then Mom would know what to do." Nora said nothing. The creek moved below them, indifferent and constant, and somewhere far up the valley a coyote called once and then was still. In the morning, when the light came gray and cold over the eastern ridge, Nora built a small fire and shook out the coat she had been using as a pillow. It had been Eliza's coat, heavy wool, the color of charcoal, worn at the elbows, but still sound. Nora had taken it without thinking, the way you take a thing that has always been yours by some logic deeper than ownership. When she shook it, something shifted in the lining. She stilled. She ran her fingers along the hem, then up toward the collar, pressing against the fabric until she found it a hardness, flat and rectangular, sewn carefully between the outer wool and the inner lining. She worked at the stitching with her thumbnail, patient and deliberate, until a small section came loose. She reached inside. The notebook was small enough to fit in her palm, covered in brown leather, worn smooth at the corners, tied with a strip of rawhide. Nora held it for a long moment without opening it, feeling the weight of it, which was greater than its size suggested. Then she untied the rawhide and opened it. The handwriting was her mother's. Precise, unhurried, unmistakable. The first page said, "Simply for Nora. In case I am not here to tell you myself." She read it 3 times before she let Cole see it. The notebook was not a diary, and it was not a letter. It was something more practical and in its own way more intimate than either. It was a record of observation, years of watching, measuring, noting, and concluding, organized with the quiet, methodical intelligence that had been Eliza Vance's most defining quality. There were notes on the creek, detailed ones written across multiple seasons, describing the way water moved through the valley's eastern stretch, where the current ran fastest, where the eddies formed, where the bottom was stone, and where it was silt. There were small, precise drawings of the creek bed at different points, annotated with numbers and arrows, and observations written in the shorthand of someone who expected to be the only reader. There were notes on fish, on the autumn salmon run that came through Stone Creek each year following the cold snap down from the high country, on the way the fish moved through water seeking the strongest current, the clearest channel, the path that cost them the least energy against the hardest work. On a particular design, a V-shaped arrangement of stones that Eliza had read about in a surveyor's report from a government expedition to the Pacific Northwest, and had then spent 2 autumns quietly testing on a small tributary behind the homestead. They followed the water Eliza had written, not randomly, predictably, the same principles every time. Build the channel correctly and you are not trapping them. You are simply making the obvious path more obvious. There were notes on shelter on the south-facing clay bank a 1/4 mile east of the creek, the one Nora had walked past 100 times without looking at it the way her mother had apparently been looking at it for years. On the thermal properties of dense earth. On the difference between a structure that fought winter and a structure that simply refused to acknowledge it. The earth holds heat the way a stone holds sunlight, Eliza had written. Not brightly, not warmly in the way you feel warmth from a fire, but steadily, without failure. Get deep enough and no storm can find you. And then in the margin, in slightly different ink, as though written later, the bank east of Stone Creek. South facing, clay goes 15 feet before it hits gravel, I measured. Cole read it over Nora's shoulder, and when he finished, he was quiet for a long time. She knew, he said. She knew this was going to happen. Nora didn't answer. She was looking at a small drawing on the inside back cover, a careful sketch of the creek bend with a V marked in the water and an arrow pointing to a spot on the south bank. Underneath in her mother's hand, this is where she had not left them a prayer. She had left them a map. They found the spot that afternoon. The south-facing bank was exactly as Eliza had described it. A steep clay wall rising 8 feet above the creek bed, dense and dark, protected from the north wind by a natural curve in the valley. The sun hit it directly from mid-morning to mid-afternoon, longer than any other exposed surface Nora had seen in the valley. Even in late October, standing with her palm flat against the clay, she could feel something, not warmth exactly, but the absence of the deep, biting cold that lived in everything else. It's just dirt, Cole said. So is everything worth building, Nora said. She made camp against the base of the bank that evening, using the overhang of a partially exposed root system for shelter and building the smallest fire she thought they could survive on. May ate dried corn from the small sack Nora had packed and fell asleep against Nora's side, and Cole sat across the fire with the notebook open on his knees, reading it again with the focused attention of a boy who had decided that understanding something was the same as controlling it. The fish come in autumn, he said, after the first hard frost. Yes, we've already had 2 frosts. The run starts after a sustained cold snap, 4 or 5 days of hard frost in a row. We haven't had that yet. Cole looked up. How do you know? Because Mom watched it for 3 years and wrote down what she saw. He looked back at the notebook. The weir takes time to build. I know. How much time do we have before the run? Nora looked at the sky, which was the particular flat gray of late October in Wyoming, the color of something that hasn't decided yet what it's going to become. 2 weeks, she said, maybe 3. Cole nodded slowly. He was doing arithmetic in his head. She could see it in the slight movement of his lips. Then, we need to start tomorrow. Yes, Nora said, we do. The work on the weir began at first light. The creek at the chosen bend ran about 12 feet wide, shallow enough to wade, but fast enough to push hard against your legs if you weren't braced for it. The bottom was mixed flat limestone slabs in some places, loose gravel in others, with occasional large boulders that had been sitting in the same positions for longer than anyone alive could remember. Nora waded in without hesitating. The cold was a physical shock, even expected, even braced for. It hit the bones, directly bypassing the muscles entirely, a deep and specific pain that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the body's fundamental objection to being submerged in 40-degree water. She did not allow herself to react to it. She stood, found her footing on the limestone, and began to look at the creek the way her mother had taught her to look at it, not as an obstacle, not as a backdrop, but as a system with its own logic and its own preferences. She could see the main current line near the thread of fastest water that ran slightly left of center. She could see where 2 smaller currents merged 20 feet upstream and where the water shallowed over a gravel bar on the right bank. She could see, if she looked carefully, the subtle differences in watercolor that indicated depth, the darker blue-green of the channel, the lighter, almost silver quality of the shallows. She took out the notebook wrapped in oilcloth against the water and looked at her mother's drawing one more time. Then she began. The principle of the weir was elegantly simple, which was perhaps why men like Silas Greer couldn't see it. It was not a dam. It did not stop the water or fight the current. It redirected two angled walls of stone extending from each bank toward the center, narrowing the creek's width progressively until the main current was funneled through a single gap, perhaps 2 feet wide. At the apex of that funnel, Nora would build a holding pen of woven willow branches, a structure designed not to capture fish by force, but to receive them at the natural conclusion of a path they would choose themselves. The fish didn't need to be tricked, they needed to be presented with the obvious route. But first, the stones. Each stone had to be selected. This was not something Nora had fully understood from the notebook until she was actually doing it. The difference between a stone that would hold and a stone that would shift, between a placement that would redirect current and one that would simply create turbulence. She spent the first morning pulling stones from the bank, examining them, rejecting most, keeping some learning through the slow accumulation of small decisions what her hands needed to know. Cole proved invaluable in ways she hadn't anticipated. He had a natural eye for flat stones, the kind with at least two parallel faces that would stack and lock, and he moved along the shallow edge of the bank with a methodical thoroughness that reminded her painfully of Eliza. He didn't talk much while he worked. He asked precise questions and listened carefully to the answers and then went back to work without comment. May stayed on the bank. Her job, self-appointed, was to sort the stones Cole brought up from the water by size, large, medium, small, arranging them in rows with the serious attention of a child who understood that what the older ones were doing was important, even if she wasn't entirely sure why. By the end of the first day, they had the right bank wall started, 6 feet of stone angled inward at the angle Eliza's drawing specified, rising about 18 inches above the creek bed. It was not impressive to look at. To anyone passing, it would have looked like a random accumulation of rock, the kind of thing water deposits naturally over years of high water events. It was not random. Every stone was placed. Silas Greer came on the third day. He rode along the creek bank on a grey horse that moved with the careful, economical gait of an animal that had been ridden over rough country for many years. He reined up at the edge of the water and looked at what Nora was doing for a long time without speaking. He was not an unkind man. This was important to understand. His face in repose had the settled, weathered quality of someone who had spent decades looking at hard things and had learned to look at them straight. He had a wife, Constance, who was generally recognized as the moral center of the valley's small community, and his treatment of her was, by the standards of the time and place, genuinely respectful. He paid his debts. He kept his word. He also had 30 years of work in the land in ways that had proven themselves through repetition. And there was a particular kind of confidence that came from that, the confidence of a man who had learned what worked and had stopped asking whether something better might exist. He looked at the stones in the water. He looked at the 3 children, wet and muddy and cold, working with the focused intensity of people who had no room for inefficiency. He looked at the lean-to Nora had built against the clay bank, a competent structure better than he had expected, and then back at the creek. "Miss Vance," he said. Nora straightened. Her back had been aching for 3 days in a continuous line of fire from her shoulders to her hips, and straightening required an effort that cost her. She did not let it show. "Mr. Greer," he looked at the stones again. "What exactly is the intention here?" "Fish trap," she said, "for the autumn run." He was quiet for a moment. His horse shifted and he settled it with a slight pressure of his knee. "You're planning to trap salmon with a pile of rocks." "Guide them," Nora said, "not trap. There's a difference. Fish go where they please, Miss Vance. They go where the current takes them, and the current goes where the channel is strongest. I'm building the channel." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that was not contempt. Contempt would have been simpler. It was something more complicated, more layered. It was the look of a man who has encountered an argument he cannot immediately refute, but is confident based on long experience that he doesn't need to. "You're on my water rights," he said. "I should tell you that." Nora met his eyes. "I know." Something shifted in his face, a slight narrowing, a recalibration. He had expected argument, perhaps, or apology. He had not expected acknowledgement delivered without flinching. The arrangement was made with your father, he said. I want to be clear, it was made fairly. I paid what was owed. I didn't take anything. I know that too, Nora said. He looked at Cole, who had stopped working and was watching Silas with the careful, assessing gaze of a 10-year-old boy taking the measure of a man. Then at May, who was still sorting stones with uninterrupted concentration. Where are you sleeping? He asked. The bank, Nora said. We're building into it. He looked at the clay bank, at the small beginning she had made in the excavation, and something moved across his face that might have been in a different man the beginning of concern. Winter comes hard here, he said now, by December. I know how winter comes, Nora said. I've lived here my whole life. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he looked back at the stone structure in the creek, and she could see him working through something, not the engineering of it, which was beyond his frame of reference, but the stubbornness of it, the sheer unreasonable commitment. I'll be watching, he said finally. I know, Nora said. He turned the gray horse and rode back along the bank the way he'd come, and Nora watched him go until he was a dark shape against the autumn color of the willows and then nothing at all. Cole waded over to her. He owns the water, he said. It was not a question. For now. What does that mean? Nora looked at the notebook in its oilcloth wrapping tucked into the waistband of her skirt. She thought about the back pages she had read and reread in the evenings by firelight while Cole and May slept. It means, she said, that we have to finish before he decides to stop us. The community's reaction arrived as community reactions tend to in the form of women. Constance Greer came first, driving a small wagon alone, carrying a covered dish and wearing the expression of someone performing an act of mercy. She was a handsome woman, Constance, with the particular authority of a person accustomed to being right about most things and gracious enough to let others discover this gradually. She set the dish down on a flat stone near the fire, a cooked ham, generous, unmistakable in its implications, and looked at the construction in the creek with an expression Nora recognized immediately. It was pity wearing the clothes of charity. You don't have to do this, Constance said. She meant it kindly. That was the most complicated part. Silas has spoken to Reverend Aldridge. There are families who would take the children for the winter, give them... We're not being taken anywhere, Cole said from the water. He said it without looking up, with the flat certainty of a boy who has decided. Constance looked at Nora. He's 10 years old. He knows his own mind, Nora said. Constance left the ham and left the PT and drove back up the valley, and Nora stood by the fire and ate the ham because they needed the food, and the act of eating it cost her something she couldn't name but could feel clearly. Verna Calloway came a week later. She was different. A widow of 8 years, lean and sun-darkened, with hands that showed the same kind of work Nora's were showing now. She did not bring food. She sat on a rock above the creek bank and watched Nora work for the better part of an hour without saying a word. Then your mother used to watch this stretch of creek. Nora looked up. Nora, years ago, Verna said, before you were old enough to remember, maybe. She'd come down here in the morning sometimes and just watch the water. She paused. I always thought she was looking for something. She was, Nora said. Verna looked at the stone walls extending into the creek at the shape of what they were becoming. She looked a long time. She did not say it was foolish. She did not offer pity or charity or the particular brand of concern that was really just certainty of failure, politely dressed. She looked at Nora. Do you need help with the willow weaving? She asked. The weir took 11 days. 11 days of wading in 40-degree water, of muscles that no longer hurt because they had moved beyond pain into a kind of numb mechanical function. 11 days of selecting, placing, testing, adjusting, of watching water respond to stone the way Eliza had said it would, the current bending and channeling and reorganizing itself according to the new geometry Nora was imposing on it. Cole worked alongside her every day, his smaller hands surprisingly effective at placing the stones that fit into gaps too tight for hers. His questions became more technical as the days passed, about current speed, about the angle of the walls, about why the gap at the apex needed to be exactly the width Eliza had specified and not wider or narrower. Nora answered what she could from the notebook and admitted freely when she didn't know, and Cole received both answers with the same focused attention. May wove willow branches. Verna Calloway had shown her how on the second day, patient and methodical, and May had taken to it with the quiet seriousness of a child given a real task. Her fingers were smaller than anyone else's and faster, and the willow trap she built with Verna's guidance was tighter and more carefully constructed than anything Nora could have managed alone. Nora was aware each evening when she looked at what they had done of something she had no better word for than rightness, not pride, exactly pride felt too loud for it. Something quieter, the sense of a thing being done as it was meant to be done, following the logic of its own design. The weir was finished on a Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, Silas Greer rode by again and stopped at the creek bank and looked at it for a long time. "Still think the fish won't come?" Nora asked. He looked at her across the water. "I think," he said carefully, "that I don't understand what you've built." "That's different from being wrong," Nora said. He sat on his horse for another moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not admiration, not yet, but the first tentative crack in a certainty he had carried for 30 years. Then he turned the horse and rode away without another word. Nora watched him go. Behind her, Cole said, "He's scared." "No," Nora said. "He's thinking. That's different." She turned back to the weir and looked at it, the two stone walls extending from the banks, the narrowing channel, the willow trap waiting at the apex, built from branches that May had woven with her small, careful hands. The water moved through the structure exactly as her mother's notes had said it would. The current concentrated in the gap, running swift and clear, pointing like an arrow toward the holding pen. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the notebook open to the page with her mother's drawing. This is where Eliza had written. Nora folded the notebook carefully, wrapped it in its oilcloth, and put it back against her body. Now they waited. The sky above the valley was the deep cloudless blue of late autumn in Wyoming, the kind of blue that looks like it goes all the way up forever. The aspens on the north-facing slopes had gone gold and were beginning to let go of their leaves one by one in the unhurried way of things that understand their season is ending and are not troubled by it. The first hard frost came that night. Nora lay on the earthen platform she had carved from the clay bank. The excavation was perhaps a third complete, enough for sleeping, not yet enough for true shelter, and listened to the temperature drop. She could hear it in the silence, the way all the small sounds of a living night went still as the cold moved in from the mountains. She could feel it in the ground beneath her, the neutral, stable coolness of deep earth that her mother had written about in the careful language of someone describing a law rather than an observation. She thought about the creek, about the fish somewhere upstream or somewhere below, feeling the cold change in the water the way they had felt it 10,000 years before she was born. Following the instructions written in their blood, the same instructions repeated without variation, season after season, pointing them toward the same beds, the same channels, the same water, following the current, taking the obvious path. She thought about her mother lying in the ground 2 miles away in the small fenced plot beside the homestead she had spent her life building. She thought about the notebook which her mother had sewn into the lining of a coat in the quiet hours of a winter night, preparing for a future she had decided not to leave to chance. Eliza Vance had been dead for 2 years. She was still in every way that counted working. "I am here," Nora thought. "I built what you drew. I am waiting where you told me to wait." Beside her, May breathed the deep, even breath of dreamless sleep. Across the small space, Cole lay on his side, facing the entrance, his eyes closed, but his expression still carrying, even in sleep, the slight furrow of someone doing arithmetic. The frost moved across the valley floor, white and silent and absolute, covering everything without distinction. The first hard frost of the season. The second would come tomorrow, and on the morning of the fourth day, the salmon would run. The fourth frost came before dawn. Nora felt it before she saw it, a deepening in the quality of the cold, something that moved past discomfort and into the territory of genuine warning. She was already awake when the light began, lying still on her earthen platform, listening to the silence that had settled over the valley like a held breath. May was curled against the clay wall, her small face slack with sleep. Cole was on his back, eyes open, staring at the low ceiling of the partially dug shelter. He had been awake for a while, she could tell by the quality of his stillness. Today, he asked. He didn't look at her. Maybe, she said, possibly tomorrow. The notebook said 4 consecutive hard frosts. The notebook said that's when she observed the run beginning. It's not a guarantee. Cole turned his head and looked at her. In the dim gray light filtering through the entrance, his face had the particular gravity of a child who has been asked to carry something heavier than children should carry and has decided to carry it anyway. What if it doesn't work? Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wind moved through the valley, low and steady, carrying the smell of snow that hadn't fallen yet but was considering it. Then we learn something, she said, and we try something else. Cole looked at the ceiling again. That's not a plan. No, Nora agreed. It's not. She rose before the light was full and went to the creek bank alone. The water was different that morning. She saw it immediately, a subtle change in the way it moved, something she wouldn't have been able to articulate to anyone who hadn't been watching the same stretch of water for 11 days, but which was as clear to her now as a change in a person's expression. The surface had a quality of intention to it, a focused, directional energy that felt different from the random, responsive movement of the days before. She knelt at the water's edge and held her hand just above the surface, feeling the cold air rising off it. She looked upstream. She looked at the weir, the stone walls extending from both banks, the narrowing channel, the willow trap at the apex. It was intact. It was exactly as she and Cole and May had built it. The water moved through it the way her mother had said it would, channeled and concentrated, running swift and purposeful through the gap. She took the notebook from inside her coat and opened it to the page with the drawing. She looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she looked at the creek. Then she put the notebook away and sat down on the bank to wait. Cole and May came down an hour after sunrise. May brought the tin cup Nora used for water and handed it to her without a word, as though she had understood instinctively that her sister had been here a long time and might be cold and might need something to hold. Nora took it and held it and felt the small warmth of the gesture more clearly than the warmth of the water inside it. They waited. The morning stretched out the way mornings do when you are waiting for something that may or may not come slowly at first, then in sudden lurches, the sun moving in increments that felt both too slow and too fast. A jay called from the willows upstream. The wind moved through the dry grass on the far bank. May drew shapes in the mud at the water's edge with a stick. Cole sat beside Nora and watched the water with the same focused attention he had brought to every day of the construction. He had the notebook now open to the fish section, reading it again with the methodical repetition of someone who has decided that understanding something completely is the most useful thing they can do with their time. She writes that they move in pulses, he said, not a continuous flow, groups. The first group is the scouts, basically larger fish, older fish ones that have made the run before. I know, Nora said. I read it. The first group establishes the path, the rest follow. He paused. She says they don't hesitate at the weir opening. She says they go straight through. Cole. What? Stop reading and watch the water. He closed the notebook. They watched. And then, so small at first that Nora thought she had imagined it, a movement in the current upstream, a disturbance in the water surface that was not wind and not current, and not the random turbulence of a stone on the creek bed, a purposeful disturbance, something with direction. She did not say anything, she held still. The first salmon came through the wide mouth of the weir at a speed that surprised her fast, deliberate, fighting the current with a power that seemed impossible for something that size. It was large, maybe 24 inches, dark on the back and faintly pink along the sides, and it moved through the water with the absolute certainty of an animal following instructions older than anything Nora could imagine. It hit the narrowing channel and she felt her breath stop. It did not slow down, it did not turn, it followed the current line directly through the gap in the stones, exactly the strongest, clearest path, exactly the way Eliza had written, exactly the way the notebook had described it would happen. It entered the willow trap, and the trap, which had looked empty and flimsy and slightly ridiculous for 11 days, suddenly held something real and silver and alive. Then the second fish came, then 3 more in rapid succession. Cole made a sound, not a word, just a sound, something that came out of him involuntarily, a release of breath held too long. May looked up from her drawings and saw the trap moving and stood up very straight, her eyes going wide. Within 20 minutes, the trap was alive with movement. Nora waded in. The cold hit her, the same as always, deep and immediate and bone specific, but this time she didn't register it the way she had on other mornings. She moved through the water toward the trap with her hands steady and her eyes clear, and she thought about her mother who had stood at this same creek on autumn mornings and watched and recorded and understood, and she felt something. She had no clean word for a connection that moved through time in both directions, backward to the woman who had figured this out and forward to whatever came next because of it. She opened the small gate on the trap and reached in with both hands. She did not take them all. This was a decision she had made before the fish came, sitting with the notebook in the evenings, reading her mother's notes about stewardship. The system only works if you maintain it, Eliza had written in the careful language of someone describing a principle rather than an instruction. Take too many and the run diminishes. Take the right number and it sustains itself for generations. Nora took 4 of the largest. She secured them on a line. She opened the gate wider and let the rest continue their journey upstream, watching them go, dark shapes moving fast against the pale stone of the creek bed, following the ancient instruction in their blood, uninterrupted and undivided in their purpose. She stood in the middle of the creek with 4 large salmon on a line, and water up to her knees, and the cold in her bones, and felt for the first time since the night her father had used the word arrangements in that specific, careful tone, something that was not fear. Cole was on the bank, and his face, the face of a boy who had spent 11 days doing arithmetic against the possibility of failure, had changed into something younger and less certain and completely unguarded. May was clapping, just clapping both hands together with the simple, uncomplicated joy of a 6-year-old who understood exactly what had happened and needed no words for it. But the valley was not done with them yet. The salmon proved the weir proved the notebook proved Eliza, and all of it together proved something that Nora had not anticipated would be a problem. It made certain people feel things they were not prepared to feel. Cole told her about the night on the 11th day after the first run. He had been restless. He was often restless in the evenings, his mind too active for sleep, and he had taken to sitting near the entrance of the partially completed dugout and reading by the last light of the fire. He had been sitting there when he heard something at the creek, not a large sound, a careful sound, the sound of someone moving slowly and deliberately and hoping not to be heard. He had not woken Nora. He had watched. He told her in the morning, his voice flat and precise and controlled in the way it got when he was telling her something he knew would make her angry. It was Mr. Greer, he said. He was at the weir for maybe 20 minutes. When he left, some of the willow weaving was loose. Nora looked at the trap. From where she stood, she could see it. A section of the willow structure on the left side, the side closest to the far bank, had been separated from the stone anchor. Not destroyed, not torn apart, carefully, methodically loosened. The kind of damage that could be mistaken for natural deterioration or current pressure or simple time. The kind of damage a man could make and then tell himself wasn't really damage. She stood at the bank for a long time. Cole stood beside her. May was still sleeping. He knows it works, Cole said. That's why he did it. Nora didn't answer. He saw the fish in the trap. He knows it works and he doesn't know how to. Cole stopped. Started again. If you're right, then he's been doing it wrong for 30 years. Nora crouched down and looked at the loosened section of weaving. Her hands, which had healed somewhat from the initial construction, would crack open again from the water. Her back, which had begun to recover some of its normal range of motion, would go back to the continuous fire. She had maybe 2 weeks of good fishing weather left before the run diminished, and possibly less time than that before the first serious snow. She opened the notebook. On the inside front cover in her mother's hand, she had read these words so many times she no longer needed to look at them to see them. The water doesn't stop. Neither should you. She looked at the loosened weaving. She looked at the creek. She looked at Cole. Go wake May, she said. We have work to do. What came next was the hardest night of Nora Vance's life up to that point, and she had already had several candidates for that distinction. She worked by firelight, which was inadequate and flickering and cast more shadow than illumination. She worked with hands that cracked open at the knuckles within the first hour, the cold water finding every small weakness and turning it into something that required ignoring. She worked with the methodical, unhurried focus of someone who has decided that emotion is a resource she cannot currently afford to spend. Cole worked beside her without being asked. May, too young to weave effectively in the dark and cold, sat wrapped in both blankets near the fire and handed them willow branches. When they needed them, her small face serious and attentive, her hands moving with the careful precision of a child who has understood that her contribution matters. The loosened section was rewoven and re-anchored by midnight. By the time the sky began to gray in the east, Nora had reinforced every section of the trap, adding a second layer of weaving to the most vulnerable points, and securing the anchor stones with additional weight on either side. When the light came fully up, she stepped back and looked at what they had built and rebuilt. It was better. The night's work, born from damage and anger and the cold, fierce energy of having nothing left to lose, had produced a trap that was stronger than the original. The second layer of weaving caught the morning light in a way that made the structure look less provisional, more permanent, more like something that tended to stay. Cole stood beside her, looking at it with red hands and hollow eyes, and an expression she recognized as the particular satisfaction of exhaustion that has produced something worth producing. He'll come back, Cole said. Maybe Nora said, or maybe he'll come and look at it and think. Think about what it means that we rebuilt it. Cole considered this. You want him to know we know. I want him to know it doesn't matter, Nora said. Whatever he does, we rebuild. That's the message. Cole found Aldous Vance on a Thursday. He had not told Nora he was going. He had weighed this decision for 4 days, the weight of the secret against the weight of what might be gained, the risk of going against the risk of not going, and had arrived at the conclusion that some things needed to be done without discussion because discussion would produce the wrong answer. He walked the 2 miles to the homestead in the early morning while Nora was working on the dugout excavation. He knocked on the door that had been his door for his entire life and waited. Aldous opened it. He looked worse than Cole had expected. Not physically, he was still large, still present in his body, in the way that working men are present, but around the eyes there was something that Cole, at 10, did not have a word for. He would understand it later in adulthood as the particular look of a man who has done something that cannot be undone and has chosen to live with it by not looking at it directly. Cole, Aldous said. I need to ask you something, Cole said. Just one thing. Aldous looked past him down the road toward the creek. Where's your sister? Working. She doesn't know I'm here. Cole looked at his father steadily. Did you know Mom left the notebook for Nora? Did you know she put it in the coat? The silence that followed was long enough that Cole understood it was not the silence of a man searching for an answer. It was the silence of a man deciding how much of an answer to give. Yes, Aldous said finally. His voice was quiet, roughened by something that was not quite emotion but was related to it. I knew. But you didn't stop her? No. Why? Another silence. Aldous looked down at his hands, which were resting on the doorframe. Strong hands, working hands that had built the house behind him from timber he had cut himself. Because your mother was smarter than me, he said. She always was. And she knew. He stopped. She knew you'd fall apart, Cole said. It came out more plainly than he had intended. Aldous looked at him. Something moved across his face, not anger, which would have been easier, but something rawer. She knew things got hard, he said. She prepared for it. That's what she did. That's who she was. So you let her do it. I couldn't stop her, even if I'd wanted to. Cole looked at his father for a long moment. He was 10 years old. He was standing in the door of the house he had grown up in, talking to the man who had signed away their future for a debt, and then signed away his oldest daughter for a jar of preserves that probably still existed somewhere in the root cellar. Nora built the weir, Cole said. It works? The fish came. Aldous said nothing. She's building a dugout in the clay bank. We have enough fish smoked to last until spring if the dugout holds the cold off. Still nothing. I'm not telling you because I want anything, Cole said. I'm telling you because Mom left her that notebook, and it worked, and you should know. He turned and walked back down the road. He was 100 yards away when he heard the door close behind him, not slam, not closed hard. Just closed. The quiet final sound of a man going back inside to stand with something he could not put down and could not yet carry differently. Cole walked back to the creek. He told Nora that evening after May was asleep. He told her everything, the look on Aldous's face, the quality of his silence, the way he had said, your mother was smarter than me, with a plainness that sounded like it cost him something. Nora listened without speaking. When Cole finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she turned away from him toward the clay wall of the partially completed dugout, and her shoulders moved once, a single brief involuntary movement, and then were still. Cole said nothing. He simply stayed where he was, present and quiet in the way that he had learned was sometimes the only useful thing. After a while, Nora turned back. Her face was composed. Her eyes were clear in the way that eyes are clear when someone has moved through something quickly and decisively and come out to the other side. We need to finish the roof section before the snow, she said. I know, Cole said. The sod bricks need to be cut thicker than I thought. The first layer isn't going to be enough. I measured this morning. We have enough grass on the south meadow. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but opening. You measured? While you were at the weir. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she picked up the spade and went back to work. The dugout had been taking shape in parallel with everything else, advancing in the margins of time between the weir work and the fishing and the daily management of staying alive. The excavation was deep now, 12 feet into the clay bank, 10 feet wide. The ceiling arched in the shallow curve that Eliza's notes specified for structural stability. The air inside was already demonstrably different from the air outside, cooler by day, but with a steadiness to it, a refusal to be affected by what the weather was doing beyond the entrance that felt less like a temperature and more like a decision. Nora had carved the sleeping platforms from the clay itself, 3 of them raised 8 inches from the floor in the way her mother had specified, high enough to stay above the coldest layer of air that pooled at ground level, low enough to fit under the ceiling with clearance. She had shaped a small hearth into the back wall, compact and carefully proportioned, and had spent 2 days constructing the flue, a narrow channel that angled upward through the clay and emerged through a collar of flat stones at the surface lined with rock to prevent collapse. The first time she lit a fire in the hearth and watched the smoke move directly and purposefully up the flue without hesitation, she sat back on her heels and felt something pass through her that she could not name, but recognized as the same quality as the moment the first fish had entered the trap: rightness, the satisfaction of a principle proven. The roof was the final critical task, and it was the one that worried her most. Eliza's notes were detailed: log frame over the entrance, bark sheets for waterproofing, sod bricks for insulation and thermal mass. But the notes were observational, descriptive of what worked, not instructional in the step-by-step way that would have been most useful. Nora had to translate principle into practice, and practice required materials, and materials required time, which was the one resource Winter was actively consuming. She cut sod bricks from the south meadow with the old spade, working in the early morning when the ground was still soft from overnight moisture. May carried them in the bucket 2 or 3 at a time, the effort showing in her face and her breathing, but never in her willingness. Cole laid the log frame across the entrance roof with the methodical care of someone who has understood that this particular structure must not fail. When the first snow came, a light exploratory snow, the kind that melts by afternoon, the sod was in place, and the bark was sealed, and the entrance had its rough plank door fitted in its frame. Nora stood in the entrance and looked out at the valley as the snow came down light and quiet and cold, and felt the temperature of the air behind her, the air inside the dugout sitting at exactly the neutral, steady coolness her mother had described. Not warm, not cold, constant. The storm that followed 3 days later was different. It came from the northwest, which was where the serious weather always came from in Wyoming, and it came with a particular combination of wind speed and temperature drop that separated the early season trials from the genuine article. The sky went the color of old iron by midday. The wind picked up before noon and was serious by mid-afternoon, coming in long, low pulses that bent the creek willows flat and drove horizontal needles of ice across the valley floor. By nightfall, it was a blizzard. Nora had been watching the sky since morning. She had spent the day before the storm in preparation, bringing the smoked fish inside, securing the firewood under the bark overhang she had built against the exterior wall, filling every container they had with water before the creek surface began to ice. She had done these things with the calm efficiency of someone executing a plan that already existed, consulting the notebook's weather section, which her mother had written with the same patient, observational precision she had brought to everything else. "You cannot stop the storm," Eliza had written. "You can only decide before it arrives that you have done what needs to be done." The door was latched. The fire was small, efficient, exactly the size Eliza's notes specified for the hearth dimensions, large enough to take the edge off the coal, small enough to burn through the night on a modest quantity of wood without requiring management. The smoke moved up the flue with the steady, purposeful draw of a system working as designed. Outside, the blizzard announced itself with a sound that had no indoor equivalent, a deep, continuous, three-dimensional roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as though the wind were not moving through the valley, but were the valley itself rearranged. Inside, the dugout received the storm the way Eliza had said it would. The walls, 18 inches of dense clay, backed by the full thermal mass of a hillside, absorbed the sound first. The roar outside became a rumble, then a low bass undercurrent, present but distant like thunder heard from inside a stone building. The temperature in the dugout held, not because of the fire, or not only the fire was small and would not have been sufficient to warm a timber cabin of the same size, but because the earth itself held. Nora pressed her palm against the back wall, the wall farthest from the entrance. It was cool to the touch, not cold, not the biting, bone-deep cold she felt when she touched the outside of the wooden door. Just cool, the deep, neutral, unconquerable cool of earth that the surface weather simply could not reach. She thought of Silas Greer in his timber cabin a mile up the valley. She thought of the wind finding every gap in his chinked walls, the fire he would need to keep burning the wood he would be consuming hour by hour through the night. She thought of this not with satisfaction. Satisfaction felt too small for it, but with a kind of clear, precise understanding. The difference between their situations was not luck. It was not even hard work, though the work had been hard. It was the difference between a structure designed to fight the winter and a structure designed to refuse it. Cole was reading. May was asleep with the self-possessed completeness she brought to sleep, her face entirely at rest, one hand open against the earthen platform. The fire gave a soft orange light to the clay walls, and the smoked fish on their rack near the flue filled the space with a rich, dense smell that was, among other things, the smell of a correct hypothesis. Nora sat with a notebook on her knee and read through the parts. She had read the most, the parts worn soft at the corners from handling, and she thought about her mother sitting somewhere at the table in the homestead kitchen, or by a lamp in the bedroom, or perhaps right here at this bank in the years when this was just an idea rather than a home, writing these words in the careful, unhurried hand of someone describing something true. She thought about us, Cole said. Nora looked up. He was watching her from across the small space, the book he'd been reading closed on his lap. She thought about exactly this moment. She planned it. Yes, that's... He stopped, started again. She was sick for a long time before she died. She knew she was dying, and the whole time she was still working, Nora said. Cole was quiet. The fire shifted and the shadows moved on the walls. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the hillside with everything it had, and the hillside did not move. I miss her, Cole said. It came out plainly without decoration, the way the truest things do. I know, Nora said. Me too. May stirred in her sleep, murmured something, and was still again. The fire burned small and steady. The earth held its temperature with the absolute patient reliability of something that has been doing this for longer than human memory and will continue doing it long after human memory ends. The storm raged for 3 full days. On the morning of the 4th day, Nora opened the door and stepped out into a world that had been remade overnight into something white and silent and absolute. The sky was a blue so sharp it seemed to ring, the kind of blue that only exists after a storm has scoured everything soft out of the atmosphere. The snow lay 4 feet deep across the valley floor, sculpted by the wind into shapes that looked deliberate, almost architectural. The entrance to the dugout was clear. The berms she had built on either side, following her mother's notes precisely, had deflected the drifting snow exactly as intended. The doorframe was accessible, the firewood stack under its bark cover was intact. A wisp of smoke rose from the stone collar of the flue into the cold, still air straight up undisturbed. Nora stood in the doorway and breathed. And then she saw the figure coming across the white field of the valley floor, a dark shape moving slowly through the deep drifts, laboring, stopping occasionally to rest, moving again with a determined, effortful gait of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it regardless of the physical cost. Silas Greer. His beard was iced over, his coat was wrong for the cold he had been in, adequate for a normal winter morning, insufficient for 3 days of a blizzard. He was moving with the specific, careful deliberateness of a man who is more tired than he wants to admit. He stopped before the entrance to the dugout. He looked at the clear entrance. He looked at the smoke rising from the hillside. He looked at Nora standing in the doorway, and his face, weathered and severe and honest in its severity, held something she had not seen there before. The grim, hard-edged humility of a man whose certainty has been broken by evidence he cannot argue with. Behind her, Cole appeared at her shoulder. then May pressing between them, looking out at the white world with her open, uncomplicated curiosity. Silas looked at the three of them. He looked at the dugout. He looked at the smoke. How did you know? He said. His voice was rough from the cold and from something else. How did you know we would hold? Nora looked at him across the white silence of the valley. She reached inside her coat and brought out the notebook. She held it up so he could see it. She did not hand it to him. Not yet. That would come later. My mother knew, she said. I just trusted her. Silas Greer stood in the snow and looked at the small leather notebook in the hand of an 18-year-old girl, and something passed across his face that was the closest thing to grief that his features were capable of producing, the grief of a man who has just understood how much he dismissed and how long ago and what it cost. Your mother was... He stopped. Eliza was the smartest person I ever met, he said. I never told her that. I should have told her that. The words fell into the cold air and stayed there. Nora looked at him for a long moment, then she stepped aside. Come in, she said. We have fish. Silas Greer sat on a stone near the small fire and held the smoked fish in both hands and did not speak for a long time. He ate slowly with the careful attention of a man who has been cold long enough that warmth requires adjustment, who needs to return to comfort gradually rather than all at once. The dugout was smaller around him. He was a large man and the space was built for 3 lean children, but he did not seem to notice. He looked at the walls, at the carved sleeping platforms, at the neat stack of firewood beside the hearth, at the rack of smoked fish near the flue. He looked at all of it with the focused, methodical gaze of a man performing an inventory of everything he had been wrong about. May watched him with the open, undisguised curiosity of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned that staring is impolite. Cole sat across the fire with the notebook closed on his knee, watching Silas the way he watched most things, carefully, without obvious judgment, recording. Nora tended the fire. She did not push him. She had learned in the months since leaving the homestead that silence was not emptiness. Sometimes it was the most productive condition available, the state in which the things that needed to be understood could finally be heard. She fed small aspen sticks into the hearth one at a time and let the fire do what it was supposed to do and waited. The roof, Silas said finally. He was not looking at anyone. He was looking at the ceiling, the sodden bark and log construction that sat 3 feet above his head at the hillside above it. How thick is it? 18 inches of sod over 6 inches of bark over the log frame, Nora said, plus whatever snow has accumulated on top. The notebook specified the bark layer as the critical one, waterproofing first, insulation second. Silas looked at the ceiling for another moment. My barn roof took off in the second night, he said. Front section, the wind got under the eave and just lifted it. He paused. Lost 3 animals to the cold before I could get them inside. I'm sorry, Nora said. He looked at her when she said it. She meant it and it showed, and she could see him registering that she meant it, registering it and not quite knowing what to do with the sincerity from a person he had spent 3 months dismissing. The wood supply, he said, we've been burning through it faster than I planned. If the winter runs long... He stopped, started again in the manner of a man who is not accustomed to admitting limitation out loud. Constance is worried. Nora went to the fish rack and took down 3 of the largest pieces, dense, dark, rich, with the oil and smoke that would keep them through weeks of cold. She wrapped them in a square of oilcloth and held them out to Silas. He looked at them, he looked at her. The weight of what it meant to take them, to accept from this girl in this place what he had come expecting to find frozen and failed was visible in his face, in the slight tightening around his eyes, in the long moment before his hands moved. He took them. I owe you an explanation, he said. You don't, Nora said. The weir. He said it to the fire, not to her. The second week, the willow section. He stopped. I know, Nora said. I knew you knew. He turned the wrapped fish over in his hands. That's the thing. I knew you'd see it and I did it anyway. because he exhaled a long, slow exhalation, the kind that carries something out with it. Because if it worked, if your pile of rocks in a creek actually worked the way you said it would, then 30 years, Nora said quietly. He looked at her. 30 years of doing it differently, she said. I understand. He was silent for a long time. The fire shifted. May had fallen asleep against the wall, her head tilted to one side with the sudden, complete way she had of dropping into sleep like a lamp turned down. Cole was watching Silas with an expression that had moved past assessment into something that looked cautiously like the beginning of respect. I was wrong, Silas said. He said it the way men of his generation said the hardest things, plainly without ornamentation, as though the plainness itself were the apology. About the weir, about the shelter, about... He gestured a small encompassing gesture that seemed to include more than the dugout, more than the creek, more than the last 3 months. About us, Cole said. Silas looked at the boy. About you, he said. Yes. It was Nora knew the most he was capable of in a single sitting, and it was more than she had expected, and it was enough. He stayed for 2 hours. When he left, the sky was the brilliant, painful blue of post-storm Wyoming, and the snow lay white and absolute across everything the eye could reach. He walked back across the valley with the 3 pieces of smoked fish tucked inside his coat, moving with slightly more ease than he had arrived with, though still slowly, still carefully, still the walk of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has set down one piece of it, but not all. Nora watched him go from the entrance of the dugout. Cole stood beside her. He'll come back, he said. Yes, she said. Different this time. Yes. Cole was quiet for a moment then. He called Mom the smartest person he ever knew. I heard he never told her. No. Nora looked at the valley, the wide expanse and the dark line of the creek visible where the current kept the surface from icing over the distant shapes of the valley's homesteads against the tree line. The world looked after the storm as though it had been clarified, as though the blizzard had stripped away everything provisional and left only what was essential. She knew anyway, Nora said. People like Mom always know. They don't need to be told. Cole thought about this. That doesn't make it less important that he should have told her. No, Nora agreed. It doesn't. She went back inside and tended the fire and thought about her mother and did not try to stop thinking about her, which she had learned was the better practice. Grief, she had found, did not diminish when you pushed it away. It only waited and returned harder. But when you let it be present, when you sat with it the way you sat with a difficult task, not fighting it, not forcing it, just working alongside it, it became something you could carry. Not light, just possible. She opened the notebook to the first page. For Nora. In case I am not here to tell you myself, she had read these words so many times that they had passed beyond meaning into something more fundamental, something that lived not in her mind but in her hands and her chest and in the particular way she stood when she was working. She turned to the last page of written notes, her mother's handwriting as precise and unhurried at the end as at the beginning, a last entry dated 3 weeks before Eliza died. She had read this page before, but she read it again now in the quiet of the dugout that her mother had designed but never seen, built with the fire burning small and correct in the hearth and the earth holding its temperature outside the storm's reach. The principles work because they are not mine, Eliza had written. I did not invent them. I only watched carefully enough to see them. This is the only real intelligence, not the making of new things, but the seeing of what has always been true. Give this to whoever needs it. That is the only way knowledge stays alive. The blizzard had changed the valley. This became clear in the days that followed, slowly, the way the most important changes always become clear, not in a single moment, but in accumulation, in the small alterations of behavior and expression that together add up to something shifted. Constance Greer came on the 6th day after the storm. She did not bring a covered dish this time, and she did not wear the expression of someone performing mercy. She drove the small wagon with its usual competence and climbed down with the practical efficiency of a woman who has decided something and is acting on it without ceremony. She looked at the dugout, she looked at the cleared entrance, the smoke from the flue, the fish rack Nora had extended outside under a bark shelter to accommodate the growing supply. She looked at all of it for a long, comprehensive moment. Then she looked at Nora. "Show me," she said. "The weir, how it works. I want to understand it." Nora showed her. They walked the creek bank together, and Nora explained the principle, the V shape, the current line, the way the fish followed the path of least resistance, the way the trap received rather than captured. She used her mother's language because her mother's language was the most precise she had available, but she translated it as she went, finding the words that connected the principle to the daily reality of a woman who managed a household and a smokehouse and an uncertain food supply through 7 months of Wyoming winter. Constance listened the way intelligent people listen, not waiting for a pause to insert her own thoughts, but actually tracking, actually absorbing, asking specific questions that showed she had understood the previous answer. "The fish don't fight it," she said, looking at the stone walls in the water. "They don't know it's there," Nora said, "like they're following the current. The current just happens to lead somewhere useful." Constance looked at the trap for a long moment. "Silas spent 3 days after the storm not saying much," she said, "which for Silas is how you know something important is happening. He came here," Nora said. "I know." Constance turned from the creek and looked at Nora directly in the straightforward way she had, not unkind but undecorated. "He told me what he did to the weir." She paused. "I want you to know that he told me himself. I didn't ask." Nora said nothing. "That matters," Constance said. "For Silas, that matters a great deal." "I know it does," Nora said. They walked back to the dugout, and Constance accepted a cup of water and sat on the stone outside the entrance and looked at the valley. After a while, she said, 3 families lost significant food stores in the storm. The Harmon place lost their root cellar to frost heave. The Pickett family's smokehouse took damage." She looked at Nora. "They'll be in trouble by February if something doesn't change." "The run will start again in spring," Nora said. "There are 2 good bends downstream that would support a weir. Better position than this one, actually, wider creek, stronger current." Constance looked at her. "Could you teach someone else to build one?" "Yes," Nora said. "That's the point." The teaching began in February, when the worst of the winter had passed its deepest point and the light began incrementally and almost imperceptibly to return. Silas came first, alone on a cold, clear morning when the snow had crusted hard enough to walk on without breaking through. He stood at the creek bank with his hands in his pockets and his hat pulled low, and the expression of a man who has decided to learn something and is not entirely comfortable with the position this places him in. Nora taught him the way her mother had taught her, not by instruction alone, but by demonstration, by showing and then watching, by letting him work with his own hands and find through his hands what the mind sometimes resists finding through words. She had him wade into the creek, which he did without comment, though she could see the cold hit him in the tightening of his jaw. She had him hold stones and feel the difference between a stone that would hold and one that would shift. She showed him the current lines and how to read them, and she watched him look at the water the way she had looked at the water in the beginning, like a man seeing something he has been walking past for 30 years without seeing. "The angle," he said. After a while, he was looking at the existing weir. "The walls have to be at a specific angle or the current goes around rather than through." "Yes." "How did your mother know the angle?" "She watched the natural V's that form in the creek after high water events," Nora said. "When the current drops debris, it forms natural V shapes pointing downstream. She measured the angles and found they averaged about 40 degrees from the bank line. Then she tested variants." Silas looked at her. "She measured debris piles." "For 2 autumns." "Yes." He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in something more like the specific amazement of a man confronted with a thoroughness he had not thought to apply to the same questions. She just looked at things until they made sense. That's all she ever did, Nora said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the weir. I'm going to tell people her name, he said. When I teach this, I'm going to tell them it came from Eliza Vance. Nora looked at him. She should get the credit, he said. It's hers. Nora felt something move through her. Not the dramatic, overwhelming emotion of the fish trap or the first night in the storm, but something quieter and in some ways more significant. The specific, precise emotion of hearing a wrong thing begin to be made right. Thank you, she said. It's just accurate, he said in the way of a man who is not comfortable with gratitude directed at his own decency. 2 days later, he brought Emmett Harmon and Dale Pickett to the creek. Both men were in their 40s, weathered and practical, with the characteristic skepticism of people who have learned that promises about easy solutions are usually lies. They stood at the bank and looked at the weir with crossed arms and expressions that Nora recognized as the same expressions Silas had worn on his first visit. Silas did something she did not expect. He turned to them and said, I thought it was foolish when I first saw it. I was wrong. I'm telling you that first so you don't waste as much time being wrong as I did. Emmett Harmon looked at the weir, then at Nora, then back at the weir. Show me, he said. She showed them. Cole worked alongside her during the teaching sessions, explaining the current dynamics with the fluency of someone who had absorbed the principle thoroughly enough to translate it. He was 10 years old, teaching grown men how to read water, and he did it with a matter-of-fact directness that after the first slight awkwardness, the men responded to the way people generally respond to genuine competence with respect regardless of its container. May was there too, waving willow branches with the quick, precise movements she had developed over months of practice, and more than once one of the men stopped and watched her hands and then looked at their own and then asked her with the humility of someone setting aside what they thought they knew if she could show them the technique. She could. Verna Calloway came in early March when the first tentative signs of thaw were beginning, the creek running a little higher, the south-facing hillsides showing the first faint green through the snow's thinning edge. She came in the late afternoon when the light was going golden across the valley floor, and she sat on the flat stone outside the dugout entrance that had become over the winter a kind of informal gathering place. She had a small wrapped bundle in her hands. I've been thinking about what to bring you for 3 months, she said with the directness that was her natural mode of speech. Food felt wrong. You have food. Tools felt impersonal. Money felt like paying off a conscience. She looked at the bundle. I keep coming back to this. She held it out. Nora unwrapped it. Inside was a sewing kit, needles of 4 different sizes, spools of heavy thread in brown and black and white, a small pair of scissors with bone handles worn smooth from years of use, a thimble of tarnished brass, the kind of kit a woman accumulated over a lifetime of use rather than purchase, complete. Those were my husband's mother's, Verna said. She was a practical woman, used everything she owned until it was used up. She would have respected what you've done here. Nora held the kit in her hands. The tools had the specific weight of things that have been used for a long time, the particular warmth of objects that carry the trace of human hands. My mother had a saying, Verna said. Her mother told her about 2 kinds of knowing. She looked out at the valley. Book knowing and watching knowing, the kind that comes from reading and the kind that comes from looking so hard and so long at the actual world that the world finally tells you something true. She paused. Your mother had the second kind, the real kind. She did, Nora said. And so do you. Nora looked at her. Don't argue with me, Verna said mildly. I've been watching you since October. I know what I see. Nora did not argue. She held the sewing kit in her lap and looked at the valley in its late winter light and felt the truth of being seen, really seen, not pitied, not dismissed, not managed, but actually observed and understood settle into her the way warmth settled into the clay walls of the dugout, slowly, completely. She would have liked you, Nora said. My mother. You're the kind of person she paid attention to. Verna smiled. It was a small, genuine smile, the kind that doesn't require the whole face. I know, she said. We used to talk, your mother and I, down by the creek sometimes, years ago. Nora looked at her. You never said. You weren't ready to hear it. She stood with the easy movement of a woman whose body still does what she asks of it. You are now. Spring came, the way it always came to the Wyoming high country, not gradually, not gently, but in argument, warm days and cold nights and sudden snow and then sudden sun, the season fighting the winter for every degree of ground temperature, until one morning you stepped outside and the fight was simply over and the world was green. The creek ran high with snowmelt, powerful and brown with sediment, and the weir structure held. The stones her mother had specified heavy, flat, interlocked, held against the spring surge the way her mother had known they would, because her mother had thought about this, had measured the spring flow, had specified stone weights accordingly. The salmon would run again in autumn, and in the autumn after that, and in the autumns that followed from the weirs that Silas and Emmett Harmon and Dale Pickett built on the downstream bends, following Nora's instruction, working with Eliza's principles. The creek and its fish would feed the valley not just through one hard winter, but through the winters that followed, the ones that Nora would not have to face in a lean-to or a dugout, but in a proper house built above the bank, with the help of men who had learned to show up differently than they had arrived. But that was later, that was future. What happened first was a morning in late April, clear and cold and brilliant, when Nora was standing at the creek bank watching the high water move through her weir structure, checking it the way she checked it every few days, looking for stones that had shifted or needed resetting, and she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Aldous Vance stood at the edge of the bank, 20 feet away. He was wearing his good coat, which meant he had made a decision about this visit before coming, had dressed for it deliberately. His hat was in his hands. He looked older than she remembered, though it had only been 7 months. He looked like a man who has spent a winter inside a house that stopped being a home some time ago and is only now allowing himself to notice. He did not come closer. He stood at the edge of the bank and looked at the weir, and then at the dugout carved into the clay hillside behind her, and then at the fish rack with its remaining stores, and then at the neat stack of firewood and the stone-colored flue and the careful, purposeful organization of everything she had built. He looked at it for a long time. Cole appeared from the dugout entrance, stopped when he saw his father, and went still. Then he looked at Nora, and she gave him the smallest possible nod, and he stayed where he was. May came out behind Cole and said, "Papa," with the uncomplicated directness of a 6-year-old for whom complicated feelings about a person did not yet modify the basic fact of who they were. She did not run to him. She simply named him and stood beside Cole and waited. Aldous looked at May for a moment, and his face did something that Nora did not look away from, though it cost her not to. Then he looked back at Nora. He did not speak for a long time. The creek ran high and loud between them, carrying snow, melt from the high country, carrying everything the winter had stored. When he spoke, his voice was rough, as though it had not been used for important things in a while. "I came to see it," he said, "or what you built." "You've seen it," Nora said. He nodded slowly. He looked at the weir. "Your mother drew that in her notebook. I saw her drawing it years ago. I didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't ask her what it was for." Nora said nothing. "I should have asked her more things," he said. It was not directed at Nora specifically. It was directed at the air, at the creek, at the absent person who was none the less present in everything around them. "I should have paid more attention. She was always—" He stopped again. "I know," Nora said. He reached into the pocket of his good coat. His hand came out, holding something small, and he looked at it for a moment, and then he walked to the flat stone at the creek's edge, the stone nearest the water, the stone Nora used as a working surface, and he set it down there. Then he stepped back. Nora walked to the stone and looked at what he had placed there. It was a ring. A simple gold band, worn thin on one side from years of wear, with a small chip in the metal near the setting where a stone had once been. Eliza's wedding ring, the one that had been on her finger when she died and that Nora had seen removed and placed in the wooden box on the bedroom shelf, the shelf that Dora had cleared by October. He had kept it. Through everything, through the death and the remarriage and the winter and the silence, he had kept it. Nora picked it up. It was lighter than she expected, smaller, the way the objects of people we love always seem smaller when we hold them because we have been carrying them much larger in our minds. She held it in her palm and looked at it. Aldous was watching her. His face had the stripped, unguarded quality of a man who has set down the last thing he was using to protect himself and is standing in the open with nothing between him and whatever comes next. I can't undo it, he said. I know that. No, Nora said. I'm not asking for... He stopped. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to have it. Nora closed her hand around the ring. She thought about her mother who had sewn a notebook into a coat lining in the quiet hours of a winter night, who had prepared for a future she would not be present to see, who had trusted not that the future would be kind, but that the right preparation could make it survivable, who had believed with the patient, observational faith of a scientist that principles held, that water followed the channel, that earth held its temperature, that the right knowledge placed in the right hands did not stop working just because the person who possessed it was gone. She thought about the ring on Eliza's finger through the years of their life here, through the winters and the dry summers and the births and the death of one child and the raising of 3 others, through the long evenings when Eliza sat at the table with her notebook and wrote down what she had seen that day, what she had understood, what she wanted to remember, what she wanted someone else to remember. Nora looked at Aldous. She did not say what she could have said. There was a great deal she could have said about the cost of his choices, about what his silence and his trust in the wrong person had taken from them, about the winter they had spent in a hole in a hillside while he sat in a warm house that was no longer recognizable as the place Eliza had built. She held all of that. She held it and she looked at it and she set it aside. Not because it wasn't true, because it was finished. Because the creek ran whether you were angry at it or not, and the seasons came regardless of whether you were ready, and the principles Eliza had spent her life understanding did not pause for human grievance. Are Cole and May safe with you? She asked. Her voice was even. If they wanted to visit. Aldous looked at her. Something shifted in his face, the specific involuntary movement of a man who has been expecting punishment and received instead a question that contains within its terms the possibility of something different from punishment. Yes, he said, his voice was low. They're safe. Then they can visit, Nora said, it when they want to. Cole from the dugout entrance made a sound that was not quite a word. May said nothing but moved slightly closer to Cole, their shoulders touching. Aldous put his hat back on. He looked at the weir, one more time at the stones in the high spring water, at the structure that had fed his children through a Wyoming winter and would feed them through the ones to come. He looked at it with the particular expression of someone looking at something they will need to carry differently from now on. He turned and walked back across the valley floor the way Silas had walked after the blizzard slowly, carefully changed. Nora watched him go. Then she slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit on her middle finger, which had not been Eliza's finger for it, but which was the finger that held it now, and it sat there with the neutral, certain weight of something that belongs where it is. The summer that followed was the best the valley had seen in a decade. 2 new weirs went up on the downstream bends built by Emmett Harmon and Dale Pickett with their own hands, following the angle specifications that Eliza had worked out over 2 autumns of observation and Nora had taught in 2 afternoons at the creek bank. Silas Greer helped both men with the stonework, and when he explained the current channeling principle to anyone who asked, he said, "This is Eliza Vance's method. She figured it out. Her daughter taught it to me." He said it every time, without exception. By midsummer, Nora had enough trade goods from the smoked fish exchanged for flour and seed and tools to engage two men for 3 weeks of timber work. They built a small house on the flat ground above the creek bank, proper timber construction with a real foundation and a south-facing window that caught the morning light. It was not large, it was sound. The dugout, which had been their home through the hardest months, was not demolished. Nora saw no reason to demolish something that worked. She had the entrance widened slightly and the interior shelving improved, and it became what her mother's notes had always suggested. It could also be the finest root cellar in the valley, its constant cool temperature keeping vegetables fresh into the following spring, serving the household and occasionally the neighbors when their own stores ran short. Cole claimed the dugout as his study. He spent evenings there by lamplight with a notebook open beside a new journal of his own, carrying forward the practice of observation that Eliza had begun, recording water levels, noting the timing of animal movements, measuring temperatures at different depths in the creek bank. He was 10 years old. He was doing science, though he did not have that word for it yet. May planted flowers on the sod roof of the dugout in late May, pressing seeds into the living earth of the hillside with the serious, methodical care of a child who understands that she is working with something that takes time. By July, the roof was blooming wild columbine and prairie clover, and the small tenacious yellow flowers that grew everywhere in the valley without being asked. The dugout that had saved their lives was by summer indistinguishable from the hillside around it. It had become, in the most complete sense, part of the land. On a September evening, with the aspens beginning to turn and the first faint cold moving down from the high peaks, Nora stood at the creek bank and watched the water. The weir was in its second year. The stones had settled further into the creek bed, become more themselves more permanent, not placed anymore just there, as natural looking as anything the water might have arranged over decades of high water seasons. The willow trap had been replaced twice, and each replacement was better than the last, tighter woven, more precisely anchored. The run would start in a week, maybe two. The first hard frost had not come yet, but she could feel it approaching in the quality of the air, in the way the mornings held cold a little longer each day, in the behavior of the creek itself, which seemed to her, and she was aware this might be imagination or might be the beginning of what her mother had possessed, to have a different quality of intention to it. She held Eliza's ring between her thumb and forefinger and turned it slowly. She thought about everything the ring had witnessed, the years of the homestead, the seasons of building and planting and harvesting, the winter that had taken Eliza and the spring that had come without her, the notebook being written, the coat lining being stitched, the careful, purposeful, loving work of a woman who understood that the most important things she knew would only matter if they survived her. She thought about Stone Creek Valley in 5 years, in 10, in 20, the weirs on the downstream bends, the knowledge moving through the community the way water moved through a channel, following the principle of least resistance, taking the obvious path, feeding things along the way. She thought about Cole's journal, which would hold observations that would be useful to someone not yet born. She thought about maize flowers on the dugout roof growing back every spring, whether anyone tended them or not. She thought about her mother, not with grief exactly. The grief was still there, would always be there, a permanent feature of the interior landscape, like the clay bank or the creek bend, present, unchanging, known. But it was not the only thing. It shared the space now with something else, something that had grown in the months of building, improving, and teaching, something that had no single name but was related to gratitude, related to inheritance, related to the specific kind of love that expresses itself not in words but in the doing of difficult things carefully. For Nora, in case I am not here to tell you myself, she had not been there. She had been everywhere. The creek ran past her feet, cold and clear and purposeful, carrying the late season water from the high country down through the valley toward wherever water went when it had finished being this particular creek in this particular place. It moved the way it always moved, following the channels and the gradients and the precise, reliable physics of water in motion, indifferent to human grief and human triumph alike, simply doing what it did because that was what it did. But through the weird structure, through the V of stones that her mother had designed and her hands had built and her neighbors had learned to replicate, the creek did something additionally. It gave, it provided, it moved fish from the upstream beds to the holding trap with the simple, unhurried efficiency of a system that has found its correct form and settled into it. Her mother had seen this, had understood it, had written it down, and Nora had trusted it. The valley had been fed. She looked at the ring one more time, then she put it back on her finger where it had sat since the morning Aldous had placed it on the stone, and she turned from the creek and walked back toward the small timber house on the flat ground above the bank where Cole was sitting in the doorway with his journal open, and May was on the roof of the dugout behind the house pulling the last of the season's columbine for drying. The aspens were gold on the north-facing slopes. The first cold of the season was in the air, and in the creek below, in the engineered channel between the stone walls her mother had imagined and her hands had built, the water was already doing what water does, finding the path, following the principle, moving always and without hesitation in the direction of where it was meant to go.